First I want to thank Manel, Carla, Alba, and Submon for inviting me to speak here and in Barcelona, and to thank the Barcelona Zoo and the university for hosting us, and the Barcelona City Hall for supporting this whole initiative. And I'm going to talk about how whales and dolphins have really driven a lot of marine research and conservation. I'm going to give a brief introduction as to how research and conservation have grown from both captivity and in the wild studies. And then I'll present an overview of where I think we are now and the great opportunities that I see in terms of protecting their habitat, not only in national waters, but on the high seas. There are huge challenges ahead that we have that relate not just to saving whales and dolphins and for humans adopting a healthy attitude toward them, but for thinking about what kind of ocean, what kind of planet that we want to live on in the coming decades. And I'm going to go first to killer whales because that's my experience and my first love. Killer whales are dolphins, however, and they actually share a lot of similar things with bottlenose dolphins in terms of the fact that they were captured and have had this period in captivity, and many of the things that we've learned about captivity and also, the pluses and minuses came also with killer whales, along with bottlenose dolphins. So I want to take you back to try to appreciate the situation in the wild and how that kind of combines with some of the problems that we see developing from a capture industry and captivity, and how that all sort of got started. And so I'll take you back to this critical time for whales and dolphins in the Northwest United States and West Coast Canada waters. In the late 1960s and 70s, there were millions of people in North America and worldwide that were starting to meet killer whales and bottlenose dolphins for the first time in aquariums, lining up to see them, so excited. And this is really before whale watching got started. Whale watching was a really small industry at that time in California, so really the only way to see them, unless you got lucky seeing them along a coast, or you went to California, was to see them in captivity. And of course, people got very excited. Dolphins have big smiles on their faces, so people thought that they were always happy. And even the dangerous killer whale, so-called dangerous killer whale, was turned into this sort of lovable sea panda in the way that they were presented to the public. So around the same time as the captivity industry was, the aquariums were really flourishing. In 1973, a small group of us started spending our summers with killer whales off the northeastern Vancouver Island in this quiet, untouched bay called Robson Bight. Now, it was at the mouth of a virgin Sitka River estuary, which at that time was the last unlogged, untouched river valley on eastern Vancouver Island. And it was really full of killer whales. And over the next few summers, we got to know the whales as individuals, and we had names for them. And we saw that they came back to these favorite places, to Robson Bight and to the areas that they knew really well year after year. And they'd also feed at the river mouth here and rest at the surface. They'd also rub on one of the beaches here. Most of this area had very sharp barnacle-encrusted rocks, but near Robson Bight, there was a place with smooth pebbles and sand, and the whales came here to rub and spend time playing. And this was something unique to these northern community killer whales, which was a kind of cultural activity that's passed on. So the Robson Bight area, where we were lucky to be doing this amazing research, we realized was a really important area for the northern community killer whales. We weren't calling it a critical habitat or a core area. Those terms didn't really exist in terms of the marine habitat at that time. Now, that same year, Mike Bigg was beginning his pioneer work on killer whale photo IDs, sorting out the individuals and the families or the pods, and his study had been financed by the Canadian government over concern that the aquarium captors in that region were taking too many whales. And the captors were saying that there are thousands out there every time they were going out, and we needed to know how many. And then 3 or 4 years after Mike started, John Ford began his work recording each pod and finding the dialects and building on this photo ID work. And it came to a point where we began to realize that the families or the pods of the orcas that we were watching were being systematically cropped year after year for aquariums. And Mike Bigg's detective work revealed that several US and Canadian aquariums and fishermen who had been targeting what turned out to be only 2 populations, totaling about 300 to 350 orcas, that these orcas have been caught 28 times over a 7-year period, and removing a total of 67 individuals, mainly going to aquariums in North America and Europe, including at least 11 who died in the nets. Now, at the same time this was happening, the loggers, and this is why I was telling you about Robson Bight, the loggers were moving in and preparing to convert the rubbing beaches and resting area and the prime salmon river habitat for this northern community, who were one of the populations being captured, into a log dump and a sorting ground at Robson Bight. And so while people were really loving to see these large dolphins, killer whales in captivity and celebrating them, they were unaware that the situation was actually completely dire, that the orcas were in danger of disappearing entirely from the Northwest, and decisions about their management were being made entirely without science. So I wrote this article at the time, interviewing the logging company executive and a lot of the people involved in killer whales. And the logging company executive was quite interesting. He said that taking the logs out of the valley upstream was completely out of the question, that it was far too expensive, and anyway, those blackfish are always on the move, and there are plenty of places for them to go. And I told him about the rubbing behavior, but remember at that time there were no published papers on killer whales at all. I mean, there was no one saying this rubbing behavior was important to protect, or even saying how many killer whales there were in the wild. Not that the logging company executives are reading the literature anyway. But at the end of the interview, he gave me this great quote that the whales will probably just rub on the logs. And that led to a debate in British Columbia, which happened over several years, which, you know, is similar in some ways to the kinds of debates that are going on now in different cities about captivity and what to do with dolphins and that sort of thing. And the questions were, did we want killer whales or did we want log booms? And a loose group of us made a public campaign, and I learned about the power of expert views and assessments, because even in the absence of published papers, the experts at that time, Mike Bigg and John Ford, went back into their data to see what they could quantify. And they came up with a statement of about how often the whales were using the bite and how this was considered a critical habitat core area. And this was really the birth of that concept with killer whales. And you can imagine orcas trying to get a breath of air in between the logs, never mind trying to rub on them. So, and the amazing result was that after debate in the legislature in 2 or 3 years and a lot of public support and a lot more articles and TV and everything else, we actually won this conservation campaign. And the loggers were not allowed to boom their logs in Robson Bight, and it was made an ecological reserve. And we felt good about it, even though it was a very, very small area. I've put a magnifying glass there. You can hardly see it, in fact. And it's about 17 square kilometers for the land area and a little bit more for the water area, although the water area is not really officially protected, although it's a de facto reserve. So we were really just learning and didn't ask for anywhere near enough. So I'll come back to the habitat issues, which is a lot of what I'm working on these days in a few minutes, but I wanted to give a brief timeline of research in the wild and in captivity leading up to where we are now. And this is really just hitting a few selective points. So I always like to go back to Aristotle to see what he has to say. I mean, he was the first marine biologist. And usually there are interesting things that are buried in that text. And in terms of photo ID, I thought it was very interesting that there's this passage where he talks about the fishermen nicking the tails of the dolphins to tell them apart. You know, whether it was actually I mean, as we know, you don't need to nick the tails, you can tell them from the dorsal fins. But he had that idea of individual identification, and really that's the first place you can see it. Now, really there was not much done for about 2,000 years after that in terms of studies in the wild. And I think one of the interesting highlights then is Carl Hubbs, who was a fish biologist in Michigan, who moved out to the southwest California, San Diego, started teaching at Scripps and the University of California, and noticed there were these rather big animals moving alongside the coastline, and looked at the literature and saw that, well, gray whales, there were some accounts of them even having gone extinct already, or that they were probably extinct. And he started getting his students involved in watching them and climbing up on the buildings of the University of California, including Ken Norris was a student at that time, was one of the people who went gray whale watching, and I'll talk about him in a couple minutes. And that really started the whale watching, as well as a lot of the research that we've seen since then. Now, between 1970 and 75, there was really a revolution in whale and dolphin research with photo ID studies. And I remember this conference in November 1975 in Indiana, which was one of the first whale conferences when people were talking about wild whale research. And there were about 50 or 60 of the experts at that time in the room. And, you know, this was a time, this is, you know, long before the internet, or even when phone calls were incredibly expensive and it took months to publish papers. And really what we had there was 3 or 4 studies that were beginning in different parts of the world. Roger Payne doing southern right whale research, and Mike Bigg with killer whale research, and gray whales with Jim Darling, and humpback whales with Steve Katona, who are all still senior figures in the field of whale and dolphin research, and Bernd Wursig with bottlenose dolphins. And they were all in the room together, and the conversations were just amazing, showing these photographs that no one had ever seen before, and that you could actually identify all these individual populations. And that was really the opening door of, this was stuff that may have happened on the plains of Africa decades below, but this was decades before, but this was the first time it happened with, out in the sea with whales and dolphins. And because of all the things, this was the opening door to being able to tell individuals where they go, do they come back, who do they socialize with, where do they migrate to. It's a baseline for the numbers, the abundance. It's a lot of things. And then you start to have acoustics and genetics on top of that, which have come in more recent years, which build on the photo ID work. So looking at on the captive side now, 1938 was the first, at least I think was the first aquarium in the US that was exhibiting bottlenose dolphins in Florida at Marineland with the Caldwells. Were doing some early research there. And you have Winthrop Kellogg and the Navy reporting on the Navy sonar studies in the US with a lot of applications for marine navigation. And I'm not going to go into detail about all the physiology and the other studies because we have people that are going to be talking about that. I'm mainly focusing on what relates to research and conservation in the wild. But there was a huge interest in whales and dolphins that was drawn, that the people were drawn to through this book, Mind of the Dolphin by John Lilly. It was a controversial character at the time, and but his books were bestsellers, and he did a lot of work in captivity, had experiments with people living with dolphins individually in captivity, and other things. And then Ken Norris really was very interesting because he started with the gray whale watching out in the wild. Then he became manager of Marineland of the Pacific, curator in the early days when they were exhibiting bottlenose dolphins and killer whales, and then went from there to becoming a naturalist in the wild and working with whales and dolphins and becoming a kind of mentor to a whole generation of scientists who are working today. And to some extent, Karen Pryor as well. She was working out in Hawaii, but also really aware of these populations of the animals out in the wild and connecting people to them. So about 25 years ago, I also came to Barcelona for the first time to see Ulysses, the killer whale, and he was all alone except for a dolphin at that time, and he'd been in Barcelona for about 12 years and was outgrowing his pool. And I came here for WDC, then WDCS, and really saying that here was a perfect candidate to experiment with this idea of returning them to the wild. At that time, Keiko, this was before Keiko, Free Willy happened, and actually that was a case of a male orca who had been in captivity for much, much longer than Ulysses, I think 20 years rather than 10 years. But anyway, we talked about this, and the discussion was, it was said that Ulysses would only be on breeding loan to SeaWorld. The decision came that was the only place that he could go, and that he would return to Barcelona when there was a bigger pool, and then they would reconsider returning him to the wild. That was actually in the quotes at the time. And at the end of this story in the LA Times in 1992, we said if he's sold or given to the Americans, he's gone forever. And Ulysses did indeed leave Barcelona, and he's actually still in San Diego. He's now the oldest male in captivity and the 5th oldest killer whale overall. And I also went to Reno Aventura in Mexico, where Keiko was. It was in the process. I was visiting all these aquariums partly as a project for WDC to do a report that would look at the educational and scientific value and other issues surrounding capture and captivity, just to see how much value there was in the view of what could you measure, what could you quantify, and really I found that even in the best cases, the amount of the budget being spent for education and research was really tiny. And partly that was a factor of it costs so much to keep these animals in captivity. The facilities, not just building the facilities, but maintaining them and having the staff and all the professional people, that there's not really a lot left over. So beyond exposing the public to the whales and the dolphins, the programs, the educational programs and the scientific work was a really very tiny part of the budget. So I think one thing that captivity did do, and what research in the wild did early on, was it set the stage for the Save the Whale movement in the late 60s and early 70s. There were other factors, like Sam Labuddy did this amazing video of dolphins being killed in tuna fishing. There were a total of 6 million dolphins killed through tuna fishing over several decades. Is really a staggering number, and this was not really being addressed. And this video just mobilized an enormous number of people, and eventually the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the U.S. came in, and a number of other laws. And the pressure of the public to have dolphin-friendly tuna and all that really has taken the number down to about 5,000 a year deaths, which is still far too many, but is a fraction of what it used to be. Also, the Greenpeace famous photograph, which I reproduced down here, of putting themselves between the harpoon and the sperm whale being killed by the Russian whalers in the early 70s. That was a really important photograph in terms of mobilizing people. So I think what we saw then, after this sort of initial conservation value from captivity and from the wild, was captivity was becoming increasingly commercial, largely motivated through the work that SeaWorld did, and the becoming a really big business. And at the same time, we were realizing in the wild research that captured animals were leaving gaps in wild populations, and that there were abuses during the captures. And of course, in captivity, we were learning that captive orcas in particular, but also dolphins, were suffering sensory deprivation, leading to serious problems. And then there was this really implosion of captive whale and dolphin business in the last 10 years, with 3 trainers being killed plus a visitor. Actually, some of that happened earlier than that, but it wasn't widely known until movies like Blackfish came out and books like Death at SeaWorld, which really made this much more of a public business, and led to a backlash against SeaWorld with declining visitor numbers and local and national laws against capturing and keeping cetaceans. Now, just as a quick sidebar, we do have this huge industry now developing in Asia, which is sort of independent of our efforts in Europe and North America, and is concerning a lot of us. China is building many new large cetacean facilities, and there are about 20 killer whales that have been captured for aquariums, largely in China, 3 of them in Moscow. But that's a whole other issue, and I think partly what we do here and what we're doing in the West, we're hoping will have some influence that will go wider as well. So what have we learned from wild and captive research and conservation? Well, I already said this about the cost leaving not much of a budget for research and education. I think we need to focus not just on saving the whales. That's something that we've learned through the conservation movement, but we have to understand, and to save their habitat, they have to have places to live in the sea and ecosystems that support them. And of course, you can't do habitat studies in captivity. So in leading into this next section, that I'm going to talk about habitat, whales and dolphins have specific vulnerability. You have 25% of the 130 marine mammal species that are threatened. It's about 25% of the 90 cetacean species as well that have an IUCN threatened category attached to them. On the other hand, they are visible indicators of biodiversity and ocean health, as was pointed out in Barcelona waters as well. Anywhere you see them, you have an idea that there is some measure of health there, unless they're traveling through quickly. And they're also flagship species that give us really powerful political and public levers for research and conservation of less popular organisms. So the overall status of marine protected areas, MPAs, marine protected areas, there are 20,000 of them worldwide. There, as of 2017, only a little more than 5% of the ocean is in MPAs, and we have an Aichi Target 11, which stipulates that 10%, the countries of the world have agreed to this, that 10% of the ocean is going to be protected by 2020, so we're still a long way from that, and only 3 years away from it. And in fact, IUCN a couple years ago revised the ideal target. 10% was a minimal target, 30% is the real target for protection in MPAs by 2030. Now, only today, less than 1%, 0.7% is highly protected, by which I mean no fishing, no industrial development at all. And it's generally agreed we need more of these areas for critical habitat of different species and that sort of thing. And really the target is at least 3% of the ocean. And most worrisome of all is how little is on the high seas, which is most of the ocean. So we have only 0.25%, less than 0.25% on the high seas, the international waters, that has any kind of protection. And there are whale and dolphin habitats represented in this, but just a few, and I'll go over some of those. The top 10 largest MPAs represent more than 50% of the global MPA coverage. So these are areas like the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and Papahanaumokuakea, which is the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. And these have fantastic marine mammal populations, but the areas were really set up with for political reasons. So it might have started with a goal for some marine mammal or biodiversity protection, but really you still have, it still goes back to the politicians that are drawing lines on the map and looking at where their fishing is and other things that they want to safely exclude. Yeah, this poster that we did in 2012 shows the 575 MPAs with whale and dolphin habitat. And these, you can see, I mean, most of them are just dots on the map. There are a few gray areas, mainly in the Pacific, that are the larger areas. And again, these are political designations, and I think it's really instructive to look where they are. They're really just along the coastlines and around islands, so they're not on the high seas. And in fact, if you look at most of these areas, many of them are just the favorite study areas of researchers and their professors. You know, that's sort of human nature, you know, where these things get protected. But they're little dots on the map, and we really need to go a lot further than that. So who's responsible for protecting the high seas? We have a couple of groups. Sorry for all the acronyms. I put a little bit down below, but OSPR in the Northeast Atlantic is doing a lot in terms of identifying areas. Most of these initiatives on the right-hand side are identification of important areas, not actual protection on the high seas. But CAMLR in the Southern Ocean is in charge of protecting Antarctic waters, and they've actually recently did set aside the Ross Sea, or part of it at least. And CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, has 7 regional marine mammal treaties and has done a lot of work in the Mediterranean here with ACABAMs in terms of identifying important habitats. Now, the United Nations areas beyond national jurisdiction, the ABNJ process, is working on a mechanism to manage high seas development and enforce the protection measures. And this is really the thing that we need, this kind of work. And it's only been in the last year that countries have agreed that they will discuss this and try and work out the process. And that's now in process. I mean, it could take 1 or 2 years, or it could be like the law of the sea and take another 10 years. We hope not. So I'm going to talk mainly about CMS because, about CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, because they've had this series of workshops around the ocean, in different parts of the ocean, to identify ecologically or biologically significant areas, EBSs, and as you know, whether they're for important diversity. And really, we did an examination of all the EBSs that have been created, several hundred of them, and found that marine mammals, and particularly whales and dolphins, were not being included very much. So really only humpback whales were included to any extent, and they're, you know, very easy pickings in terms of identifying where their breeding habitat is in Hawaii and Caribbean and that sort of thing. So only 15% of all these EBSs had any marine mammals listed as a primary feature, and they were often, marine mammals were often being used just in a general way. You know, there's biodiversity here, and you know, this species of whale is there, you know, so let's include that, which is not a very, it's not a very scientific, data-driven way of doing this work. And there was really no standardized method for presenting this evidence or agreeing to it from workshop to workshop. So we set up initially a committee on marine mammal protected areas and started holding conferences beginning in 2009 in Hawaii to bring the marine protected area people together with the whale and dolphin and other marine mammal people. And out of that, in 2013, we realized we needed something with teeth to try to influence the process of getting protected areas and habitat for whales and dolphins on the open ocean. So we set up this task force under the IUCN within the Species Survival Commission and the World Commission on Protected Areas. And we spent a couple of years going around talking to different UN bodies and IUCN and governments and getting support for the idea. And we talked to the bird people too, because as usual, the bird people are far ahead of the marine mammal people in any work that like this that's going on. And in fact, they were really driving the EBSA process in the ocean in terms of they had the data, they had supported by 30 plus years of work and 1,000 plus bird scientists and millions of bird watchers and many NGOs in every country. And they're, they created these things called IBAs, important bird areas, which are now called important bird and biodiversity areas. And in Europe, for example, the SACs, the special areas of conservation, really an enormous number of them came from IBAs. They started as IBAs, and they were just able to say, okay, that's a candidate SAC, because the bird people had done their homework. And the whale and dolphin people were a couple of decades behind. So we realized that we needed a strategy to get marine mammals into this conservation planning. So we developed this tool called IMAs, Important Marine Mammal Areas, and brought together a lot of experts. This is the definition of it: a discrete area of habitat important for one or more marine mammal species that has the potential to be delineated and managed for conservation. So basic definition, and it's important to realize an IMA is not an MPA, and an MPAs are not IMAs. So these are non-political tools to inform the development and management practice of place-based conservation. And the rationale for developing them is, again, to have a consistent expert process that's independent of socioeconomic as well as political concerns, to give input into the habitats for all the marine mammals and their biodiversity, and contributing to these national and international conservation tools and habitat protection measures, including the EBSAs. Also, KBAs is something that IUCN has developed, key biodiversity areas, which is now coming on stream. It's a more threshold-driven tool than what we have, but it's going to be very important. And also national and regional measures are important. Marine spatial planning, more than 100 countries of the world have signed up to marine spatial planning, including Europe, across Europe, which means that decisions are going to be made in the national waters of all these countries about what they're going to, how they're going to zone their waters. And if we don't have any marine mammal data, they won't be considered at all. So it's really important to have this tool to be able to come to the table. So we spent more than a year working on the criteria. I won't go into that in detail. There's a lot of information on this website, marinemammalhabitat.org, which gives the background of all this. But the one thing to say about this is that we really tried to align the criteria very carefully to the existing CBD EBSA criteria to the KBA criteria to existing criteria that's being used to define important habitats, so that, we're not reinventing anything, but we're making sure, we wanted to make sure that marine mammals were accounted for. So this process that we've developed for identification, anyone can submit an area of interest, and from that area of interest, we have a series of workshops, and at a workshop, the areas of interest then are considered to become candidate IMAs, which come out of this expert workshop, and then they go to an independent panel, peer-reviewed panel, and sometimes we'll go back to the workshop or back to individual people before finally being approved. And this was sort of our starting point for the first workshop, which was last year. And this just gives you an idea of what marine mammal habitat we have under consideration as it stands, or as it stood last year. The red areas are existing marine protected areas with marine mammal habitat, with important marine mammal habitat. The blue areas are proposed. The tan areas are CBD, EBSA areas with marine mammals. And then there are a lot of smaller areas that you can't quite see that are like International Maritime Organization ship areas that are trying to avoid hitting cetaceans and that sort of thing. And this is actually just a slightly more recent version of that same map. This is what we started with in the Mediterranean a year ago, and again with the red being existing areas and blue proposed, and tan areas EBSAs. And through an expert workshop in Hania, Greece, with about 25 or 30 experts from around the Mediterranean, this was the resulting. Actually, this is the map that's been through the expert process. So you can view this in detail with descriptions of all these areas. You can see there is one along the coast here. Manel was part of this process and contributed valuable data that became an IMA there. And about 80% of the IMAs that were proposed were accepted in this case. And then in the spring, we're trying to do at least one of these workshops a year. We have funding for about 5 or 6 years. This was in the Pacific Islands, and you can just see the candidate IMAs because they have not finished the expert process. There are about 28 of them, and the blue areas are the areas of interest. We should have those available end of October. And so our first area was the Mediterranean, the Pacific Islands, and then next March we're going to the Northeast Indian Ocean. And we have started arrangements for the workshops after that in 2019, 2020, and 2021. And it looks like we also have some funding for an Antarctic workshop as well. But there's still gaps, so it's a big work to cover the whole ocean. Following up from IMAs, we have a component of this project that is trying to implement 3 of the IMAs that are created as case studies. So the IMA process itself is pure science. The implementation is, can you make it a marine protected area, or does this make sense being a an area that's under subject to ship strike, and you want to create, work with the IMO to for that, or any number of things. But it's the whole implementation. So the first one we're doing there will be in Palau in October, and there are just a small group of us going there to work on dugong and spinner dolphin IMA in the inshore waters. So we want to just try to introduce IMAs into marine mammal habitat considerations really at all levels that are possible. And we already see from the Mediterranean some interest in the areas that were really just announced in the last month or so, really just finalized this summer. And there is traction already in some of these areas in terms of getting governments to look at them and say, okay, this is an international body of scientists that using a tool that's recognized by all these agencies, okay, we better pay attention to it. So, we have some hope. We'll see. So the big question is how we get from here and here and here, being taking the public from the pool and from the narrow areas along the sea, along the coastlines out into the open ocean, and to get them to care about them enough to protect what's going on. So I think coming back to this map, this is our huge challenge and our opportunity over the next few years. While the fishing industry, oil and gas, and others are working really hard to develop the ocean for industrial potential, we also need to harness the public passion for whales and dolphins and to use the goodwill that we're building up by recognizing that dolphins don't belong in captivity and doing something about it as we are here. And maybe this will help lead to more attention toward protecting their homes on the high seas and pelagic waters as well, where these sort of new battlegrounds of conservation are emerging. And I think the key will be implementing and creating MPAs, effective MPAs, which is actually a whole other subject. So I've heard the idea that Barcelona wants to keep the links to these individual dolphins and to follow their lives wherever they go, which I think is great. And I think also that aquariums can build links to research in the wild through remote monitoring, hydrophones, all these other ways to link work that's going on offshore from Barcelona, and to bring it right to the people where they are. And this is something that's starting to happen. I see it with seabirds, and I see it in some different land-based centers in different parts of the world. And I think that's a really exciting role for zoos and aquariums. And I think maybe one day people on land can be actually the monitors for what is going on in the open ocean as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, for your talk. Thank you for this wide scope vision. It's interesting to know that even if most of the species of cetaceans are already protected, if we don't do anything for the habitat, or the habitat is not protected, then it's worth it. It's worth it to protect the species. It was a pleasure to see this image, this zoom out of the problem. We are here talking at the end of 6 individuals, but I think that we have also to focus on these ones. We have time for some questions. Si algú vol fer alguna pregunta?
Are there any questions? We've got one. Hello, good morning. I'm Marta Goma. I'm the president of EPANA. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. And I'm very grateful to the Barcelona Town Council for this fantastic initiative to set this workshop. I have a very specific question regarding CITES. CITES has been authorizing imports and captures according to a supposed scientific research. Those of us who work in conservation and are concerned about the animal welfare, we know very well, as you have illustrated, that the part of the budget that it's spent in aquaria in scientific research is very little. And I guess that they do that just as an excuse, as a justification to say that they do educational activities and scientific research of cetacean behavior in captivity. But in practice, that's not the case. So here we have a very serious problem. We had an issue in Loro Parque with a killer whale there. It was very controversial because as long as CITES keeps authorizing imports because they believe that according to scientific criteria they have to give their authorization, well, we will never get anywhere. All of us countries that are part of the CITES, in the case of Europe, for example. So I would like to know your experience at the IUCN, your connection with CITES, if you have dealt with the topic, if there is a will to reach an agreement, if CITES someday will be able to say, or will be daring enough, bold enough to say, look, we can't authorize this import because these animals will be exploited. They will not be subject to scientific research. So I'm very interested in this CITES situation because as long as they authorize these imports and exchanges, we will never put an end to captivity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a big, difficult question. I don't work with CITES. There are other people in the group that groups that I work with who are experts in that. However, yes, we come up against it. I work in Russia, for example, and we have killer whale. We look at the CITES permits for killer whales being exported from Russia to China and see that they can get them, although they don't always get them, which is another issue. But it's, I think one of the issues has to do whether they're endangered or not. And there may be somebody else who can come in on this. But if they carry an endangered status, that's a red flag, and that endangered status comes from the IUCN, indeed. But IUCN is a big sprawling organization, so that's the red list, which is decided by different groups within the Species Survival Commission, and fortunately or unfortunately, killer whales and bottlenose dolphins are not considered endangered. However, there are populations of them that are. For example, the west coast of the U.S. it carries an endangered rating from the U.S., which is quite strong, that southern community that was captured so much. So, there would be no way that they would be able to, to capture them. They'd have the entire, state of Washington and beyond, stopping it. But it's, and I think there are bottlenose dolphin populations in the Mediterranean are endangered, aren't they? Yeah. So Black Sea, yeah. So there are ways around it. That's what happens. And what you call research and what you call education, that's really tough. And is it not research or any education because your budget is 10 million and you only spend 1,000 euros a year? It's not really fair, of course, but I'm not sure what you can do. I think it'll come down to individual governments and individual places, deciding that, things have moved on, as Barcelona is seeing, and Mexico City recently, and more places. And, that's the way it ends. Do you have anything else to say about CITES? No.
But nonetheless, Eric, we will have a session this after lunch with some aspects of legal activities and legal aspects, and I think that we can move these questions to this after lunch and then focus on the presentation. There is another question around here? No, here.
Hi, I work with Manel and Alba and Carla in Submon. So my question is more directed to what you mentioned about increasing the awareness of people, of the public citizens for the marine mammal protected areas. And as Manel said, now in Submon we're very, very interested in increasing perception of the citizens on how the ocean affects them, how everything's important. So what is your opinion about doing this through tourism? So taking them whale watching, getting them closer to the sea. Would you agree to do that maybe even in the marine mammal protected areas to increase also not just the awareness but also bring some more money and maybe pay for those protected areas and make them survive long term? Or do you think the drawbacks would be worse and you're not?
Well, it's a question that has to be answered differently depending on the place in the world. In general, yes, I think it's a good idea, and it can provide valuable tourism income, and it has. We look at places like Iceland, where it's really revitalized a lot of northern communities, and Iceland has a nice geography in the sense that boats can go out from all different sides of the country. When you have places like the northwest U.S. San Juan Islands and southern Vancouver Island, you have the opposite kind of situation where you have a lot of boats coming from two different countries and 5 or 6 different cities all converging on one small area. And you have a huge problem there, and it should go back to a lot more land-based whale watching there, which is also very possible. I mean, I think land-based, when you can do land-based or remote work with any marine animal, there's a lot of remote watching done with seabirds, for example, in Scotland. Which is tremendous, and it's really high definition cameras looking. It's not quite so possible with dolphins, but I think yes, tourism is one of the answers, and it helps support marine protected areas. But you need to do zoning, that recognize that there's certain critical habitats that shouldn't be disturbed. There are other areas where you can have mixed boats and the animals, and people can see them and appreciate them. But Barcelona also we could have hydrophones out there. We could have a lot of stuff going on out there with the research that's coming in to the city and really creating a huge impact, and in good timing for the marine mammal biennial coming up, and another task for you to do over the next 2 years. No, I think it could be really exciting to do, because people don't realize what's right out there on their doorstep.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for staying here, Eric. I support you everything you say. The first I want to say. I don't like to any animal in captivity, any, just not mammifers, it's any.
Okay.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Okay, the question is about, we talk about the movie about fish. I remember we talking, I remember also the cough, another movie. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is, I don't like any animal in captivity. Mm-hmm. Especially dolphin or other cats. But the problem is in wild is that many countries don't respect international convention and kill many dolphins, sharks, whales. So what is the solution for you? Because if we don't like animals in captivity, and then we don't respect in the wild, what is the solution? You understand what I mean?
Yes, but I think...
Thank you very much.
I think we can educate, without captivity. I think actually captivity is giving the wrong message, really, in terms of what people see by us bringing animals into captivity. So to do it in the wild, yes, you're right. There are huge challenges to doing that. And 30 or 40 years ago, we would have said it was impossible to do. But now we do have this huge whale watching industry. There are 15 million people a year now going whale watching in more than 100 countries. So it has grown tremendously. And actually several million of that, about 2 million, are from land, in places like South Africa, Argentina, US, West Coast, and really interacting, being able to see the animals watch natural behavior without disturbing them. So I think there are a lot of lessons that are starting to be gained from wild behavior, and the challenge now is to bring that even more and to go further out into the high seas and see what's out there, because we have not just more than 50% of the surface area, but we have 99% of the habitats on the planet are in the deep ocean, and we're completely missing that. So I think with technology, I think our technology is really, this is where it comes in and can be really valuable in terms of bringing those messages back.
Okay, thank you. We have time for only one more question. Well then, have to be...
Well,
no.
¿sí? Hola. Hola, Eric.
Hello, Eric. My question... Hello, here. I'm connected to the oceanography and meteorology, and with this new concept of protected areas, with the changes that we see in the oceans, it's a very dynamic thing because it has a connection with the atmosphere, and we forecast many changes, and this is due to global warming, acidification. So how do you integrate this in your new concept and in the future of these new protected areas?
Well, it's, part of the challenge with all this is that we do have the background of, huge changes going on our planet as well as the ocean. The IMAs, the important marine mammal area concept does have we've had some thinking about climate change and how these could be monitors for climate change, by getting baseline data and then revisiting them periodically. So, but that's sort of scientific monitoring. In terms of actual marine protected areas, allowing for it, people are talking about, marine protected area managers are talking about things like creating zones, so that, there's more latitude for movement. Already we have, marine mammals are highly mobile anyway, so, that you have larger areas generally than you have on land. So the challenges are different than with climate change on land, and acidification, of course, is different. But yeah, I think we're all facing these things, and they're being written into the management plans of marine protected areas. But, it's difficult for us to see 5 years in advance, much less, 10 or 20 years in advance, which is what we're talking about. So we're all in the same boat together, really. Yeah.
Okay, then we have two more questions, one in the second line and one in the third line, and then after that we will have a coffee break and we'll have time to talk. Then Isabella, please.
Hi, Isabella, University of Paris. I'll be quick,
Yeah.
I promise. I was just wondering, I've read a few papers recently that say discussing animal welfare specifically in terms of wild dolphins and wild marine mammals and conservation can be really useful, and it sort of brings it away from the population discussion to more individuals. I was just wondering, in your new group with the IMAs and your workshops, does the word welfare come up yet at all, or is it something you're thinking about? Or?
It doesn't come up with IMAs, really. I mean, let me think. I mean, it's in the background, but it's not like a criteria. But there is a criterion that talks about individual. Well, it's more in the sense of culture, that you have different small groups that might behave differently, and you can. That's something that we perceive as being valuable, but it's not a welfare. No, I don't think so. I mean, it would come up with. I suppose in some marine protected area contexts, it would come up, but not really in IMAs. Yeah.
Okay, then the last one, please.
Yeah.
Hola, bon dia.
Good morning. I'm Dorcy Carey from the Zoo 21 Citizen Initiative. We basically have gathered and collected signatures so that we can transform the Barcelona Zoo. It's been a pleasure to listen to you with this history of conservation. It's a luxury to have you here and to get to know the evolution of your work and this work that you have been doing. One of the things that we propose is precisely having to do with the budgets that are devoted to animals in captivity, and they don't have enough budget for education and research as they should do. So we propose that they should spend this money in conservation of the habitat. So we have a network of 300 zoos, so if they spend this money in the actual conservation of habitats, and with the technologies that we have today in aquaria, well, we've got fantastic technology to show how conservation of habitats is done through immersive virtual technology. Sorry, could you go to the point, to your question? So I think that the scientific community, there is no consensus, I believe, in the scientific community regarding the scientific criteria as to how conservation is to be done. Is it better done in captivity or spending resources? And there are studies that propose dolphin studies that say that dolphins in captivity are okay, that populations are maintained, and this is a contradiction to me. So, to your mind, as a scientist, which is the perspective of the scientific community regarding these positions as to which are the best conservation models for endangered species?
Well, I mean, it depends on the species, but I would say, you know, obviously my focus is in the wild and what's happening, you know, supporting that work, because that, I mean, in the end, that's all you have. You know, we you know, and it's so important for our own survival as well, is to have a healthy ocean and healthy land areas for animals. I mean, I think the way you were describing it was really nice. You know, if you could, you know, use that kind of money to support work that's going on in the wild through marine protected areas, and then gain a connection to those areas, and use that information both about the support that you're giving and the what's going on in those habitats with those animals. You know, to me, that's by far the best use of that. So, not sure I answered your question, but I tried.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Very difficult questions.
Thank you, Eric, for your answers. Thank you for your talk. Then acomiadem aquesta sessió. Gràcies.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure to have you here. L'Eric, ara anirem al coffee break.
We'll break for coffee now, and we'll be back at 12:15. There's someone outside that will guide you to the coffee break area, which is upstairs. Eric has brought these books with him, and well, he has offered very generous discounts on the price, but we don't have many copies. I don't think he flew with Welling, but we know that, you know, hand baggage is limited. So basically he has these leaflets, these discount vouchers for the attendees of the workshop. So you can enjoy between 30 and 35% of discounts plus a poster, a gift. So if you're interested, if you want Eric to send you this book, and you will enjoy that, the discount plus the poster. See you back at 12:15.